I still remember the exact moment my world shattered, standing in my father's study in our family home in Charleston, South Carolina, surrounded by mahogany furniture and the scent of his favorite cigars, watching my sister Claire's perfectly manicured hand slide across the new will dated just 3 days before Dad died. Her diamond bracelet catching the afternoon light as she smiled at me with those cold blue eyes and said the words that would echo in my head for months afterward. Looks like Daddy finally realized who really took care of him at the end. My name is Chloe Simmons. I'm 36 years old, and until that Tuesday in October when everything fell apart, I thought I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged in this world. The lawyer, Mr. Patterson, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses who had handled our family's affairs for decades, shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, the old wood creaking beneath him as he avoided my eyes and cleared his throat with a sound that felt like gravel scraping against my ears. Miss Simmons, I understand this comes as a shock, but the will is quite clear. Your father left the house, the investment portfolio, and the majority of his liquid assets to your sister Claire, citing her dedicated care during his final illness. I couldn't breathe. The air in that study suddenly too thick, too hot, smelling of old books and betrayal, my hands gripping the armrests of my chair so hard my knuckles turned white as bone. That's impossible. I was there every weekend. I took him to every single chemotherapy appointment. I sat with him through the nights when he couldn't sleep. I held his hand when he was scared. Claire, my younger sister by 4 years, leaned back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had already won, her blonde hair pulled back in a flawless ponytail, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. You were there on weekends, Chloe. I was there every single day. I moved into the guest house. I managed his medications, his meals, his comfort. You had your little life in Atlanta, your teaching job, your tiny apartment. You couldn't be bothered to give up everything like I did. The thing is, she wasn't entirely wrong, and that's what made it hurt so much worse. Like a knife sliding between my ribs with surgical precision, I had kept my job as a high school English teacher in Atlanta, driving the 4 hours to Charleston every Friday after school, spending weekends with Dad, then driving back Sunday nights to prepare for Monday classes. Exhausted and grief-stricken, but trying to maintain some semblance of stability in my life because someone had told me once that you can't pour from an empty cup, that you have to take care of yourself too. Claire had moved back home 6 months before Dad died, into the guest house behind the main property, a charming cottage with wisteria growing over the doorway. And yes, she had been there daily, but I had sent money for his care. I had researched treatments. I had held his hand through the worst moments I could manage to be there for, and somehow none of that mattered anymore. The estate is valued at approximately $3.7 million, Mr. Patterson continued, his voice distant like he was reading a grocery list instead of dismantling my entire sense of family and fairness. Miss Claire Simmons receives the primary residence valued at $1.2 million, the investment portfolio currently worth $1.8 million, and liquid assets of approximately $600,000. Miss Chloe Simmons receives a sum of $50,000 and her father's personal library. $50,000 and his books. That was what I was worth, what our relationship was worth, what all those years of phone calls and visits and holding his hand and telling him stories to distract him from the pain amounted to in the cold mathematics of inheritance law. Claire stood up, smoothing her dress with deliberate slowness. I hope there are no hard feelings, Chloe. Daddy knew I sacrificed more. He wanted to make sure I was taken care of since I gave up my career to be with him. Her career? She made it sound so noble. The truth was Claire had been fired from her marketing job in Colombia for sleeping with a married client, a scandal that had made her unemployable in her field. Moving back home hadn't been sacrifice. It had been necessity. But Dad, in his final months, confused by medication and illness, hadn't remembered that or hadn't cared, or maybe Claire had whispered different stories into his failing ears during those long days I wasn't there. I left that office without another word, walking out into October sunshine that felt too bright, too cheerful for the devastation coursing through my veins. My car was parked 3 blocks away on Broad Street, and I walked past tourists taking photos of Rainbow Row houses, past the smell of she-crab soup wafting from restaurant kitchens, past street musicians playing jazz that sounded like celebration when all I felt was the death of something fundamental inside me. That night in my Atlanta apartment, a cramped 1-bedroom in Virginia Highland with thin walls and creaky floors, I sat on my worn sofa holding one of Dad's books, a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird that he'd read to me when I was 8 years old. His voice doing all the character accents, making me laugh even at the serious parts, and I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes were so swollen I couldn't open them properly. The kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep in your chest, where you keep all the things you thought were permanent and unbreakable. The money wasn't even the worst part. Though $50,000 versus $3.7 million was objectively cruel, the worst part was knowing that my father, in his final days, had believed Claire's version of events more than he'd believed in me, had thought I cared less, had loved him less, when the truth was I had been trying so desperately to keep myself together so I could be strong for him, and it hadn't mattered at all. I went back to teaching on Monday because I didn't know what else to do, standing in front of 30 teenagers trying to explain the themes of betrayal in Julius Caesar, my voice mechanical and distant, and one of my students, a perceptive girl named Maya, who always sat in the front row, raised her hand and asked if I was okay, and I lied and said I was fine, just tired, when really I felt like I was drowning in quicksand with no one close enough to throw me a rope. Claire called me 3 times that week. I didn't answer. She left voicemails that started sympathetic and progressively grew more irritated. "Chloe, I know you're upset, but this is what Daddy wanted. You need to accept it and move on. Call me back so we can discuss the logistics of clearing out your things from the house. I'm planning some renovations, and I need to know what you want to keep." My things, as if I had accumulated possessions there like a guest instead of a daughter who had grown up in that house, who had measured her height against the door frame in the kitchen every birthday, who had fallen off her bike in that driveway and still had the scar on her knee, who had slow danced with her prom date in that living room while Dad took embarrassing photos. Memories weren't logistics. They were the architecture of my entire childhood, and Claire was talking about renovations like she was flipping an investment property. I finally answered on the Friday night, sitting in my car in the school parking lot after a particularly brutal day of parent-teacher conferences. "What do you want, Claire?" "Don't be like that." Her voice was syrupy sweet with an edge underneath, like honey over broken glass. "I'm trying to be considerate. I know this is hard for you, but we're still sisters. We're still family. I don't want this to ruin our relationship." I laughed, a bitter sound that surprised even me with its harshness. "Our relationship? You manipulated a dying man to steal my inheritance, and you're worried about our relationship. That's rich, Claire. That's really something." "I didn't steal anything." Her voice turned cold immediately, the pretense dropping away. "I earned it. I was there. I did the work." "You want to feel victimized because you couldn't be bothered to give up your precious career and your precious apartment. That's on you, not me. I sent money. I came every single weekend. I called him every day. Money and phone calls. How meaningful, How sacrificial. I wiped his forehead when he had fever dreams. I changed his bedding when he was too sick to make it to the bathroom. I held him when he cried because he was scared of dying. Where were you for that, Chloe? I hung up on her because if I kept listening, I would say something unforgivable or worse. I would start believing she was right. That I had failed Dad somehow. That I deserved this punishment disguised as inheritance. The following weeks passed in a gray blur. I taught my classes, I graded papers, I existed in the mechanical way people do when they're just trying to survive each day without falling apart completely. My friends noticed something was wrong, but I couldn't explain it without crying. And I was so tired of crying, tired of feeling like a victim in a story I hadn't chosen to be part of. Thanksgiving came and went. I spent it alone with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine that turned into 2 bottles, scrolling through old photos on my phone of Dad, of our family back when Mom was still alive, back when things made sense, before cancer took her when I was 19 and Claire was 15, before it came back for Dad 20 years later, like it had unfinished business with the Simmons family. Claire sent me a photo of Thanksgiving dinner at the house. Our house. Her house now, the dining room table set beautifully with Mom's china, the chandelier I remembered helping Dad clean one summer, Claire and her husband Marcus sitting at opposite ends like Lord and Lady of the Manor, Marcus Hartwell, a real estate developer I'd met maybe 5 times in the 10 years they'd been married, handsome in that bland catalog model way, always checking his phone, always talking about deals and developments and properties like people were just obstacles to his next commission. Christmas was worse. Claire actually expected me to come to Charleston, to stay in the guest house like a visitor in my own childhood home. She sent a group text to extended family explaining how she'd love to host everyone for the holidays in our beautiful family home. And I wanted to throw my phone across the room, but instead I politely declined, citing work obligations that didn't exist. January brought a new semester and a strange kind of numbness that felt almost like healing but wasn't. More like scar tissue forming over a wound that was still infected underneath. I went through the motions. I smiled when appropriate. I stopped crying every night. I told myself I was moving forward when really I was just moving, directionless, untethered from the narrative I'd built my life around. Then in February, on a Wednesday afternoon, when I was sitting in a coffee shop in Little 5 Points grading essays on The Great Gatsby, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A Charleston area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Miss Simmons. This is Detective Rachel Morrison with the Charleston Police Department. I'm calling about your sister, Claire Hartwell. My heart stopped, all the anger evaporating in an instant replaced by pure animal fear. Is she okay? What happened? She's physically fine, Miss Simmons, but I need to ask you some questions about her husband, Marcus Hartwell, and his business dealings. Are you aware of any financial difficulties or unusual business practices? I sat up straighter, students at nearby tables suddenly too close, their conversations too loud. I don't know anything about Marcus's business. I barely know him. What's this about? Mr. Hartwell is under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. We have evidence he's been running a scheme involving falsified property appraisals and mortgage fraud. We're interviewing family members to establish a timeline. Would you be willing to come to Charleston to answer some questions? I agreed without thinking, drove to Charleston that Friday, met Detective Morrison in a windowless room that smelled like stale coffee and desperation, told her truthfully that I knew nothing about Marcus or his business, that Claire and I hadn't been close for years, hadn't spoken since that terrible phone call in October. Your sister claims she had no knowledge of her husband's activities, Detective Morrison said, watching my face carefully, looking for something I couldn't identify. She says she's devastated, that she trusted him completely, that she's a victim in this situation. Of course, Claire was playing the victim. That was her specialty, wrapping herself in innocence like a cloak while chaos swirled around her. I don't know what she knew or didn't know, Detective. I'm sorry I can't be more helpful. But driving back to Atlanta that night, something was stirring in my chest. Not quite hope, but something sharp and focused that I hadn't felt in months. A sense that maybe the universe was paying attention after all, that maybe karma wasn't dead, just slow. I started researching, spending my evenings falling down internet rabbit holes about Marcus Hartwell and Hartwell Development Group, his company that specialized in luxury residential developments across the Southeast. Articles from Charleston business journals praising his vision, his success, his philanthropic work. But underneath, if you looked hard enough, there were whispers. Unhappy investors, delayed projects, lawsuits settled quietly out of court. The indictment came in March. Marcus was arrested at his office downtown, charges including wire fraud, bank fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying documents. His bail was set at $2 million. Claire paid it using the investment portfolio Dad had left her, and I felt something dark and satisfying curl in my stomach at the thought of Dad's money being used to bail out a criminal. Claire called me for the first time in months, crying, hysterical. "Chloe, please, I need you. I don't know what to do. Marcus says it's all a misunderstanding, that he's being targeted, but they froze all his accounts, all our accounts. I can't access anything." "That's terrible, Claire," I said, my voice flat and cold as winter steel. "Have you tried sacrificing more? Maybe that's the answer. Maybe if you give up everything, you'll be rewarded for it." She was silent for a long moment, then her voice dropped to something poisonous. "You're enjoying this, aren't you? You're happy to see me suffering." "I'm not happy about anything, Claire. I'm just not surprised. You aligned yourself with someone who takes shortcuts, who believes the rules don't apply to him. Kind of fitting, actually." She hung up on me, and I sat there in my apartment feeling nothing and everything simultaneously. The numbness cracking around the edges, letting something else seep through. Not quite satisfaction, but close. The trial was set for September. I followed every development like I was studying for the most important exam of my life, learning about shell corporations and fraudulent appraisals and how Marcus had convinced dozens of investors to put money into developments that were either vastly overvalued or didn't exist at all. A pyramid scheme dressed up in architectural renderings and glossy brochures. In May, Claire sold the Charleston house, my childhood home, had to sell it to cover legal fees and keep Marcus's defense team working. She got $1.1 million for it. Less than Dad had paid 30 years ago when you adjusted for inflation. The new owners were a young couple from Ohio who wanted to renovate it into a bed and breakfast. Another piece of my history turned into someone else's future. I drove past it one weekend. Couldn't help myself. There were dumpsters in the driveway, construction workers gutting the interior, all those memories being thrown away like garbage. The door frame where we'd measured our heights was probably already gone, painted over or torn out, and I sat in my car across the street crying again, but this time it felt different, cleaner somehow, like I was finally mourning properly instead of just nursing rage. Claire and Marcus moved into a rental condo in Mount Pleasant, downsizing from 4,000 square feet to 1,200. I heard this from a cousin who was still speaking to both of us, though barely, trying to maintain neutrality in a war she didn't understand. Claire had taken a job at a real estate office, entry level, making cold calls to potential clients. The woman who'd inherited millions was now working for $20 an hour plus commission. The trial started on a Tuesday in September. I took the week off work, told my principal I had family obligations, which wasn't technically a lie, drove to Charleston and sat in the courthouse gallery every single day, watching Marcus in his expensive suit that couldn't hide the fear in his eyes, watching Claire beside him trying to look supportive, but mostly looking exhausted. Her blonde hair not as perfectly styled, her clothes nice but not designer, the armor of wealth stripped away, revealing something smaller and more frightened underneath. The prosecution was methodical and brutal, presenting emails, financial records, testimony from investors who'd lost their life savings, an elderly couple from Greenville who'd invested their entire retirement fund in a luxury condo development that was supposed to be built on Folly Beach. But the property had turned out to be a vacant lot with zoning issues that made development impossible. Marcus had known this, had sold units anyway, had pocketed the deposits. I watched Claire's face as the evidence mounted, watched her realize fully, probably for the first time, that her husband wasn't being targeted or misunderstood. He was guilty, genuinely and thoroughly guilty of ruining lives for profit. And there was something almost satisfying about witnessing that realization, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon, guilty on all counts. Marcus showed no emotion, but Claire gasped like she'd been slapped, her hand going to her mouth, her eyes finding mine across the courtroom for just a second before she looked away. And in that moment, I saw everything: the fear, the humiliation, the desperate scrambling realization that her carefully constructed life was over. Sentencing was set for November. Marcus was released on bail again, but this time Claire couldn't cover it. The investment portfolio was gone, liquidated to pay legal fees and partial restitution. A wealthy uncle on Marcus's side put up the money, probably already calculating how to distance himself from the scandal. I went back to Atlanta feeling something I hadn't felt in almost a year. Not quite joy, but a sense of cosmic rightness. Like the scales were finally balancing, even if it took the universe longer than I would have liked. Claire had taken everything from me, had manipulated and schemed and wrapped herself in righteousness, and now she was losing everything too. Not because I'd orchestrated it, but because actions have consequences, because the universe keeps better books than we think. October came around again. 1 year since that terrible day in the lawyer's office. 1 year of grief and rage and slow, painful processing. And I was different now. Harder in some ways, but also clearer. Like fire burning away everything that wasn't essential. Then, on a Wednesday morning, I got an email that changed everything. From an attorney I didn't know, David Chen from a firm in Columbia. Dear Miss Simmons, I represent a group of investors who lost significant sums in the Hartwell development fraud case. We are pursuing civil litigation against Marcus Hartwell and any entities that benefited from the fraudulent activities. We believe your sister, Claire Hartwell, may have been more involved than she claimed at trial. We have obtained discovery that suggests she signed off on several questionable transactions and was a partial owner of one of the shell corporations used in the scheme. We wanted to reach out to you as a potential witness to her character and involvement in family financial matters. I read the email 3 times, my coffee getting cold beside me, students arriving for first period outside my classroom door, and I understood what was being offered here, a chance to testify, to share what I knew about Claire, her character, her willingness to manipulate situations to her advantage. Nothing false, nothing invented, just the truth of who my sister was. And that truth could put her away too, could take whatever remained of her freedom and dignity. I met with David Chen the following week. A sharp-eyed man in his 40s with a reputation for aggressive prosecution of white-collar crime, his office in downtown Columbia overlooked the State House, autumn sun streaming through windows onto stacks of legal documents. We believe Claire Hartwell was an active participant in at least 3 of the fraudulent schemes, he explained, showing me documents I didn't fully understand, corporate filings with her name, emails discussing property valuations. She's claiming she was deceived by her husband, that she signed documents without reading them, but the evidence suggests otherwise. She was present at meetings with investors, she showed properties, she reassured people who had concerns. At minimum, she was willfully ignorant. At worst, she was a co-conspirator. "What are you asking from me?" I said, though I already knew. "Testify to her character. Tell the jury about the inheritance situation. Establish a pattern of manipulation and self-interest. Show that she's capable of doing whatever benefits her regardless of who gets hurt." I thought about Dad, about those last months, about Claire whispering poison into his medicated ears, thought about $50,000 and his books while she got millions, thought about her voice on the phone saying I hadn't sacrificed enough, hadn't earned his love the way she had. "I'll testify," I said. The deposition was scheduled for December. I spent weeks preparing with David Chen's team, going over every detail of the inheritance, Claire's history, her patterns of behavior. It wasn't revenge, I told myself. It was just truth. Just accurate testimony about the kind of person she was. If that truth happened to destroy her, that wasn't my fault. That was hers. Marcus's sentencing happened first, mid-November, 12 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all assets, restitution orders that would follow him for the rest of his life. Claire wasn't in the courtroom that day. I heard through the family gossip network that she'd filed for divorce the week before, trying to distance herself, trying to survive. My deposition was on a Tuesday morning, in a conference room with Claire and her attorney present. She looked terrible. 20 pounds thinner, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, wearing clothes from Target instead of Nordstrom. And when our eyes met across that conference table, I saw something I'd never seen in her before, genuine fear. Not the performative kind, but the real animal terror of someone who knows the trap is closing. David Chen asked his questions and I answered honestly, described Claire's manipulation of Dad, her history of bending truth to serve her needs, her complete lack of remorse about the inheritance, the way she justified taking everything because she believed she deserved it. Claire's attorney tried to object, to redirect, but the facts were the facts. The truth was the truth, and by the time we finished 4 hours later, Claire was crying, quiet tears running down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. In the hallway afterward, she caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please, Chloe, please don't do this. I'm sorry about Dad. I'm sorry about everything. I'll give you money, whatever I have left. Just don't testify at trial. They're going to send me to prison." I looked at her hand on my arm, at her desperate face, at everything she'd been and everything she'd become, and I felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no pity, just a vast empty space where my love for her used to live. "You should have thought about consequences when you were making choices, Claire. You taught me that. Remember, actions have results. You just never thought they'd apply to you." I pulled my arm free and walked away, and I didn't look back, not even when she called my name, not even when her voice broke on a sob that might have been real or might have been another manipulation. I was done being moved by her performance. The civil trial started in February. I testified on a Wednesday, told the jury everything about Claire's character, her patterns, her choices. The prosecutor played audio from my deposition, showed emails Claire had sent boasting about the inheritance, about how she'd secured her future, about how I'd been too weak to do what was necessary. Claire took the stand in her own defense, claimed she'd been abused by Marcus, controlled, manipulated, that she'd signed documents she didn't understand out of fear. Her attorney painted her as another victim, a naive wife deceived by a criminal husband. But the jury saw through it, or maybe they just saw the truth underneath, that Claire had always been willing to do whatever benefited Claire, and this time she'd finally gone too far. The verdict came in March, 2 years after Marcus's arrest. Guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty of wire fraud, guilty of making false statements. Claire Hartwell was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, forfeiture of all remaining assets, restitution orders she'd never be able to pay. I was in the courtroom when the sentence was read, watched Claire's face crumble, watched her attorney put a hand on her shoulder while she sobbed, watched the marshals lead her away in handcuffs, her designer life reduced to a prison number and an orange jumpsuit. I drove back to Atlanta that night, my hands steady on the wheel, NPR playing softly through the speakers, talking about spring weather and cherry blossoms and new beginnings. The sun setting over the highway in shades of orange and pink that looked like the world was on fire in the most beautiful way. My apartment felt different when I got home. Lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying weight I didn't realize was there until it was gone. I made tea, sat on my sofa with Dad's first edition Mockingbird, ran my fingers over the worn cover, remembered his voice reading it to me, doing the accents, making me laugh. The inheritance was gone. Every penny Claire had gotten from Dad had been liquidated for legal fees and restitution, parceled out to Marcus's victims. The house was a bed and breakfast now. Someone else's dream, someone else's story. Everything she'd schemed and manipulated to get had vanished like it was never real to begin with. I thought about calling her, maybe someday, when enough time had passed. Thought about forgiveness and family, and what we owe each other when the blood we share turns bitter, but not yet, not now, maybe not ever. Some bridges burn so completely that even the ashes blow away. My phone buzzed with a text from my cousin. I heard about Claire. Are you okay? I typed back, I'm fine. I'm good actually. I'm free. And I was. Free from the weight of betrayal. Free from the rage that had consumed me for 2 years. Free from the fantasy that family meant loyalty or love or anything other than genetics and choice. And I'd chosen to let Claire face the consequences of her own actions. Not because I was cruel, but because I was done being the person who protected her from reality. Spring came to Atlanta with dogwoods blooming and warm rain. I planted flowers on my tiny balcony, went on dates that went nowhere but were pleasant anyway, had dinner with friends who'd waited patiently for me to come back to myself, taught my students about justice and consequence in the literature we studied, showed them how stories worked when people made choices and faced what came after. Sometimes late at night, I thought about Claire in prison, wondered if she understood yet. If she'd ever understand that she hadn't been punished for being with Dad at the end, she'd been punished for everything that came after. For the cruelty, the greed, the willingness to destroy what was left of our family for money that wasn't even really hers to claim. Dad's books lined my shelves now. $50,000 had bought me a small house in Decatur with a real yard and space for all his collection, first editions and signed copies and paperbacks so worn the spines were cracked white. I read them slowly, one at a time, finding notes he'd written in the margins. His handwriting getting shakier toward the end, observations about themes and characters and what it all meant. In one, a copy of East of Eden, he'd written in the back cover, "We're all our brother's keeper, but we have to keep ourselves first. Remember that, Chloe. Remember you matter too." I cried reading that, understanding that maybe he had known. Maybe in his own way through the confusion and medication he'd tried to tell me something, tried to leave me what really mattered, not money or houses, but the reminder that I had value beyond what I sacrificed, beyond what I gave away. Claire would be eligible for parole in 4 years. I didn't know if I'd be there when she got out, didn't know if I wanted to be. Some wounds heal and some just scar over, and you learn to live with the changed landscape of yourself. The last time I drove through Charleston, I didn't go past the old house. Didn't need to anymore. I went to the cemetery instead. Stood at Dad's grave with flowers and memories, and forgiveness I'd finally found for him. Understanding that he'd been sick and scared and easily influenced, that he'd made a terrible choice, but it was just a choice. Not a judgment on my worth, not a measure of my love. "I'm okay, Dad," I said to the granite marker, to the Carolina sky, to whatever remained of him in the earth or air or somewhere I couldn't see. "I'm better than okay. I'm free." And walking back to my car through the cemetery gates, past other families visiting other graves, past the weight of all that grief and history, I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. Since before Dad got sick, before everything fell apart, I felt light. I felt clean. I felt like maybe the story wasn't over but just beginning again. And this time I got to write it myself. This time nobody could take that away. Claire had taken my inheritance, but I'd taken something infinitely more valuable from her. I'd taken the lie she'd built her life around, the belief that she could do anything without consequence, that she was special enough to escape the rules that governed everyone else. I'd stripped that away not through cruelty, but through truth, through testimony, through standing in a courtroom and saying, "This is who she really is. This is what she's really capable of," and letting justice do what justice does when the light finally finds the darkness. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. And I carried it with me back to Atlanta. Back to my little house and my teaching job and my small good life that nobody could steal because it was built on truth instead of deception, on work instead of manipulation, on the solid ground of knowing exactly who I was and what I deserved, and refusing to settle for less ever again. No matter who asked, no matter what they promised, no matter how much it cost to stand firm and claim my worth, the price of dignity was always worth paying, and I'd paid it in full.